The term plant-based diet has come into vogue in recent years. The idea is that a plant-based diet is inherently easier on the climate, easier on the environment, whereas livestock or animal agriculture is inherently hard on the environment. It produces more greenhouse gas emissions. It's more carbon intensive. It releases more carbon into the atmosphere. It sequesters less carbon. So I want to talk about those issues, and I'm going to do so by reference to an article from Nature Food. So this article from Nature Food says global greenhouse gas emissions from animal-based foods are twice those of plant-based foods. I'm going to read part of the first paragraph. It says, the global population has quadrupled over the last century. Demographic growth and associated economic growth have increased global food demand and caused dietary changes such as eating more animal-based products. The United Nations projects that food production from plants and animals will need to increase 70% by 2050 compared to 2009 to meet increasing food demand. This will drive the expansion of food subsectors, including crop cultivation and livestock production, as well as product transportation and processing, materials, fertilizer and pesticides, and irrigation. Increased food production may accelerate land use changes for agriculture, resulting in greater greenhouse gas emissions, reduced carbon sequestration, and further climate change. So this is in contrast with another article that I'm just going to touch upon and maybe cover it more in a future episode, but it's from the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation. It's from 2016. The lead author is William Teague, and it's entitled The Role of Ruminants in Reducing Agriculture's Carbon Footprint in North America. So this suggests, surprisingly to some, that ruminants, cattle, might have a role to play in actually reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture in North America. So what's the difference between these two articles? And the difference is that one of them, this article in Nature, it's overgeneralizing, and it's talking about the situation such as it is, instead of making any distinctions between best practices and worst practices. So I'm going to go to a document here that contains my critiques of the Nature article. But first, let me show you one more thing in it. Down here on page 5, you've got two graphs. The bars in blue represent greenhouse gas emissions from commodities, that is, crops, plant-based foods. The bars in orange represent greenhouse gas emissions from animal-based products, from livestock. So look at this big orange bar here. This big orange bar is beef, and up here, the big blue bar is rice. So one would conclude by looking at these charts that if we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, the thing to do is to grow less rice and especially grow less beef, because beef is twice the greenhouse gas emissions of rice, twice the greenhouse gas emissions of cow milk, 3 times the greenhouse gas emissions of pork, 4 times the greenhouse gas emissions of chicken meat. So that would be the logical conclusion from kind of a surface understanding of this article, but we're going to go beneath the surface and find out what's going on. And this document is my critique of the Nature article. So my critique is that the Nature food article does not distinguish between best practices and worst practices or typical practices. On the other hand, this article in Journal of Soil and Water Conservation suggests that certain practices, certain best practices, could be part of the solution to North America's carbon footprint. So, questions. Here are some questions that are not asked. I have about a dozen or more questions. These are the questions that are not asked by the Nature article, and therefore they're issues that are not being raised based on the analysis that's done by the way the issues are framed. You take everything, you put it in one big pile, and you say that is inevitable. But that is not inevitable because there is a better way of doing things. But here are some of the questions that the Nature article is not asking. So one thing is, how is the animal feed grown? Animal feed can be grass or it can be grain. If you're growing grain, then that's going to have more of a carbon footprint than you are if the animal is raised exclusively on grass. But the Nature article is not asking these questions. Another question that should be asked is, how do they use nitrogen fertilizers on the animal feed? If so, why? Why are we using nitrogen fertilizers? So nitrogen fertilizers take a whole lot of natural gas to make, and so as soon as after that bag of fertilizer is made, then you've already got some embedded greenhouse gas emissions in it, just by virtue of the fact that you're holding a bag of nitrogen fertilizer. Not to mention that there are other greenhouse gases associated with growing monocrops in such a way, with that. The nitrogen fertilizers, if you use it, it's the way that it's done, it's going to cause carbon emissions. Can't go into that now. But here's another question. Do they use tillage for the animal feed? So when they grow the animal feed, are they using tillage? Are they using nitrogen fertilizers? Are they monocrops? Next question. Why not compare grain-fed with grass-fed? Why are we not comparing best practices and worst practices? Why are we not comparing the, grass-fed cattle and other animals can be carbon negative, meaning carbon is coming from the atmosphere and being put in the ground. It could be that way. Not that just because an animal is grass-fed doesn't mean it's carbon negative, but it could be. And best management practices could provide for carbon negative situations. Another question, are we deforesting to graze cattle? If we're deforesting to graze cattle, for one thing, does it have to be that way? Is it inevitable that cattle are going to graze on deforested land? And is it inevitable that cattle are going to be fed grain that is grown on deforested land? I say no, but we're not even asking these questions. And this is a prevailing theme within many of the articles that I've read that relate to animal agriculture. There was an Oxford study that it's just, let's take everything and put it in one big pile, and we say this pile is inevitable. The prevailing practices are the way things are, and they're not going to be any other way. So the story goes. Next question, are we using holistic management to turn deserts into grasslands? We could do that. We could be using holistic management to turn deserts into grasslands. It can be done. It has been done. It has been proven. And so we could be doing that instead of deforesting to graze or deforesting to grow crops for grain to feed the animals. Next question, are we burning millions of hectares annually? Well, it's terribly destructive. Burning is almost always destructive. We could be grazing instead of burning. The purpose of burning is often to kind of help the fertility so that, after the burning, then the grass comes back. But we could be helping the fertility with grazing instead of burning, and we should be doing it that way. Alan Savory says that burning is almost never indicated, almost never justified, and I agree. Next question, are we using GMO crops and or monocrops? This grain that's being fed to the animals, is it a GMO crop? If so, that means ecological degradation. That means carbon is coming out of the soil and into the atmosphere, because that's how GMO crops work. That's how most monocrops work. Most monocrops, including GMO crops, are going to contribute carbon to the atmosphere. It doesn't have to be that way. We could do it differently. Are we willing to do it different? Next question, are we growing food in biologically diverse systems? Biologically diverse farms typically are going to absorb carbon, whereas monocrops are typically going to emit carbon. It takes because a growing, developing ecosystem is absorbing carbon. That's what they do. When an ecosystem is growing, it's going to absorb carbon, it's going to absorb water, whereas a monocrop is typically going to release carbon into the atmosphere. Almost always. Next question, are we maximizing yield per acre or nutrition per acre? This is a Vandana Shiva concept. Farmers are focused on yield. They've been taught to focus on yield. Well, Gabe Brown will say, yeah, I care about my yield, but I care more about my profits. And I care more about the quality of my soil. So we don't have to focus on yield, but we've been trained and taught to focus on yield. But we could focus on nutrition per acre. We could be measuring the amount of nutrition that comes off of that acre, and almost always you're going to get more nutrition per acre in a biologically diverse farming system. Are we allowing indigenous people to keep their land, or are we pushing them off their land? So, just saying, if we're being colonizers, if we're pushing people off of their land and into the cities so that they can provide cheap labor, let's ruin the economics of farming in the places where indigenous people live, and drive them off of their land either through economics or legal means or illegal means or all three. And so we don't have, this is a question that is not being asked in the Nature article. Are we allowing the World Trade Organization to trade deals to deprive people of the right to grow their own food close to home equitably and sustainably? If so, they can grow crops equitably and sustainably, and they can grow livestock equitably and sustainably. It's not whether it's a crop or whether it's livestock. It's whether it's equitable, sustainable, ecological, regenerative, restorative. Next question, are we giving people the right to food sovereignty? It'd be great for everyone's carbon footprint if we gave people the right to food sovereignty. Every country should have the right to protect the interest of its own people, but the empire, the U.S. empire, including the World Trade Organization, it deprives countries of the right to food sovereignty. Next question, is it fair to say that commodities are junk food? I think it is. I think commodities are junk food. We can do some of that. And, if a commodity keeps somebody alive, then great. But let's not pretend that that is anything close to optimal nutrition. We need to move away from commodities and more toward biologically diverse farms that can grow really good nutrition, and stop acting like rice and corn and wheat are nutritious. They are empty calories, usually. Next question, are we subsidizing bad practices such as tillage is usually a bad practice, deforestation? Are we subsidizing chemical fertilizers? You bet. Are we subsidizing biocides? You bet. Are we subsidizing CAFOs? Uh-huh. All the way from we're subsidizing every step, everything that it takes to make if you buy a hamburger that came from a concentrated animal feeding operation, the fossil fuels were subsidized. The grain was subsidized. The pesticides are subsidized. The fertilizers are subsidized. The equipment is subsidized. So we're subsidizing bad practices. Are we subsidizing commodity crops? Yeah. Are we subsidizing low nutrient food? Yes. Are we subsidizing the denial of food sovereignty? Yes. We pay for the military enforces the trade deals. That is denying people food sovereignty. Trade deals, are we subsidizing trade deals that allow some countries to dump low-priced commodities on other countries? Yeah, we dump low-priced subsidized rice on Haiti. The Haitian markets are polluted with rice that has been grown by American farmers at below cost. How are Haitian farmers going to compete with commodities that are dumped on their markets at below cost? It's the same thing with Mexican farmers and corn. It's the same thing with chicken. We're dumping food on these people at below cost. There's no way their own markets, their own farmers can survive that. Are we subsidizing trade deals that prevent countries from protecting the interests of their own people? You bet. Conclusion. The conclusion is that the Nature article fails by not asking good questions. If you ask bad questions, you're going to get bad answers. If you ask good questions, there's a good chance that you're going to get good answers. So the Nature article purports to be an objective analysis of the way things are, but it fails to distinguish between the best practices and the typical or worst practices. The worst practices are the typical practices. The typical practices are, there's so many subsidies that, these subsidies are taxpayer dollars that are going to the government and from the government into the pockets, typically of the wealthiest people. And it's bad for the climate, among other things. It's bad for the climate and the environment. It's bad for social justice, etc. So, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Talk to you soon.